Over the skies of northern Italy, at an altitude of 12,000 feet, Captain James Richardson banked his P-47 Thunderbolt through a formation of clouds that hung like cotton over the Adriatic Sea. It was March 9th, 1944, and Richardson had just completed his 23rd mission with the 332nd Fighter Group. The German pilots who tracked his distinctive flying pattern through their gun sights believed they understood aerial combat. They had trained in the established doctrines, mastered the textbook maneuvers, and trusted that warfare in the sky followed predictable rules. They were about to discover how catastrophically wrong they were. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What those experienced aviators could never have anticipated was that Richardson's unconventional approach to aerial engagement, born from necessity and refined through innovation, would fundamentally challenge every assumption they held about air superiority, and in doing so, rewrite the tactical manual for fighter operations in ways that would influence aviation doctrine for generations to come. James Richardson grew up in the rural countryside of North Carolina, in a small community called Pine Grove that consisted of fewer than 300 residents, most of them farming families who had worked the same land for generations. His father, Samuel Richardson, operated a modest agricultural business that specialized in tobacco cultivation, working 60 acres that had belonged to his father before him. His mother, Dorothy Richardson, was one of only 2 certified teachers serving the segregated school that educated black children from 5 surrounding communities, often teaching students ranging from age 6 to 16 in a single classroom. The Richardson home was a modest wooden structure with 4 rooms, heated by a single wood stove that Samuel would rise at 4 each morning to stoke, ensuring his family woke to warmth even in the coldest months of winter. The house sat on a small rise overlooking fields that stretched toward distant tree lines, and from the window beside his bed, young James could watch the dawn arrive each day, painting the sky in shades that shifted from deep purple to brilliant orange. From his earliest memories, James possessed an unusual fascination with the mechanics of movement, spending hours observing how birds adjusted their wing angles to catch different air currents, how they could hover almost motionlessly against strong winds, and how they executed turns that seemed to defy the laws of physics he would later study in borrowed textbooks. His mother noticed this unusual fixation when James was barely 5 years old, watching as he stood motionless in the yard for nearly an hour, his eyes tracking a hawk that circled overhead, his small hands unconsciously mimicking the subtle adjustments the bird made to its wing position. Dorothy encouraged this curiosity, bringing home books from the county library system whenever she could find materials related to flight, mechanics, or natural science. The library served white patrons only, but Dorothy had established a quiet arrangement with one of the librarians, a woman named Mrs. Henderson, who believed that knowledge should not be constrained by the color line. Every 2 weeks, Dorothy would leave a list of requested books in a specific location, and Mrs. Henderson would discreetly set aside those volumes for after-hours pickup. Through this covert system, James gained access to texts that most children in his community would never encounter. By the time James reached age 10, he had read everything he could find about the Wright brothers, about the early aviators who had barnstormed across America in the years following the Great War, about the principles of lift and drag and thrust. He filled notebooks with observations and calculations, trying to understand the mathematical relationships that governed flight. His father, while supportive of his son's education, worried that these interests would lead only to frustration and disappointment in a world where opportunities for black Americans, particularly in fields like aviation, were virtually non-existent. By the age of 14, James had already demonstrated an exceptional aptitude for mathematics and spatial reasoning, skills that caught the attention of his mother's colleague, a teacher named Marcus Webb, who had studied engineering before the economic collapse of 1929, forced him back to his hometown. Webb had completed 3 years at Howard University in Washington, studying mechanical engineering with dreams of working for one of the major industrial companies developing automotive technology. Those dreams evaporated when the economy collapsed, and opportunities for black engineers, already limited, disappeared entirely. Webb returned to North Carolina, carrying with him a deep frustration about wasted potential, both his own and that of countless other talented individuals whose opportunities had been constrained by circumstances beyond their control. He channeled that frustration into teaching, determined that at least some young people in his community would have access to knowledge that might, in better times or better circumstances, open doors that had been closed to him. When Webb first encountered James, the boy was 12 years old and had already developed theories about wing design that showed remarkable sophistication for someone with no formal training. Webb recognized immediately that James possessed not just intelligence but a specific type of analytical thinking that was particularly rare. The boy could visualize three-dimensional objects mentally, rotating them and manipulating them in his imagination with a facility that Webb had seen in only a handful of engineering students during his university years. Webb spent his weekends teaching James principles of aerodynamics, using hand-drawn diagrams and models constructed from scrap wood and fabric. They would meet at Webb's small house on Saturday mornings, and Webb would present concepts from his university textbooks, which he had carefully preserved despite having no professional opportunity to apply the knowledge they contained. James absorbed these lessons with an intensity that reminded Webb of why he had loved engineering in the first place. Together, they built crude gliders that James would test from the hills near his family's property, meticulously recording the results of each design modification in notebooks that would fill an entire shelf by the time he turned 18. These experiments followed a rigorous scientific method that Webb insisted upon. They would formulate a hypothesis about how a particular design change would affect performance, build a model incorporating that change, test it under various wind conditions, record detailed observations, and then analyze the results to determine whether their hypothesis had been supported. The first glider they built, constructed from pine strips and cotton fabric, stretched tight and sealed with homemade varnish, flew for approximately 3 seconds before nosing into the ground. James had expected disappointment at this failure, but Webb was delighted, explaining that they had learned something valuable. Their initial wing loading calculations had been incorrect, and now they had empirical data that would help them develop better estimates. Over the next 4 years, they built and tested 37 different glider designs, each one incorporating lessons from previous attempts. By the time James was 16, their gliders could maintain controlled flight for nearly a minute under favorable wind conditions, covering distances of over 200 yards. James had developed an intuitive understanding of how air flowed over wings, how weight distribution affected stability, and how control surfaces could be used to manage an aircraft's trajectory. These weekend experiments attracted attention from other young people in the community, and soon James and Webb were teaching a small group of students the principles of flight and engineering. Most of these students would never have opportunities to apply this knowledge professionally, but Webb believed that education had value beyond immediate practical application. Understanding how the world worked, he told his students, changed how you saw your place in it. The outbreak of conflict in Europe seemed impossibly distant from the tobacco fields and pine forests of North Carolina, but James followed the news with intense interest, reading every report about the aerial campaigns over Britain and France. The county library received newspapers that were several days old, passed along after white patrons had finished with them, and James would pore over these papers, searching for information about aircraft performance, tactics, and the evolving nature of aerial warfare. He understood with a clarity that few around him shared that this conflict would be decided as much in the sky as on the ground. The reports from Europe described air battles involving hundreds of aircraft, industrial production of planes at rates that would have seemed impossible just a few years earlier, and the development of tactical doctrines that were being written in real time as commanders adapted to new technologies and new challenges. James began collecting data about aircraft specifications, compiling tables that compared the performance characteristics of different fighter types. He tracked which aircraft were being used by which nations, noted how designs evolved in response to combat experience, and tried to understand the strategic thinking that drove these developments. This data collection served no immediate purpose. James had no reason to believe he would ever have the opportunity to apply this knowledge, but the work itself satisfied something fundamental in his nature, a need to understand systems and patterns that went beyond mere curiosity. When the United States entered the confrontation in December 1941, James was 22 years old and working as a mechanic at a local airfield, having been denied entry to every aviation school he had applied to. The airfield was a small private facility owned by a white businessman named Robert Crawford, who used it primarily for crop dusting operations and occasional recreational flying. Crawford had hired James after the mechanic, who had previously maintained his aircraft, left to join the military, and James had demonstrated within his first week that he understood aircraft systems better than most certified mechanics Crawford had worked with. The job paid modestly, but gave James something he valued more than money: access to actual aircraft. During slow periods, Crawford would sometimes allow James to sit in the cockpit of his Stearman biplane, explaining the function of various instruments and controls. Crawford never offered to teach James to fly, and James never asked, both of them understanding without discussion that such an arrangement would violate the unwritten rules that governed race relations in that time and place. But James learned anyway, studying the aircraft manuals that Crawford kept in the hangar office, memorizing the procedures for starting engines, managing fuel mixtures, and operating the various systems that kept an aircraft airborne. He would sit in the cockpit during his lunch breaks, hands on the controls, mentally rehearsing the sequence of actions required for takeoff, flight, and landing. In his imagination, he had flown countless hours before he ever left the ground. The announcement of the Tuskegee training program in 1942 opened a door that James had believed permanently closed. When he first read about the program in a newspaper that was already a week old by the time it reached Pine Grove, he felt a surge of emotion so intense that he had to step outside the hangar and walk for several minutes to compose himself. The possibility that he might actually fly, might be able to apply all the knowledge he had accumulated over years of study and observation, seemed almost too precious to acknowledge. He told his parents that evening about his intention to apply, and the conversation that followed revealed the complexity of their feelings. Dorothy was proud but terrified, understanding that military service, particularly in a combat role, carried enormous risks. Samuel was more ambivalent, torn between wanting his son to have opportunities he himself had never enjoyed, and fearing that those opportunities would come at a terrible cost. They talked late into the night, Samuel expressing concerns about whether the military would truly treat black pilots as equals, Dorothy insisting that someone had to be first, that opportunities only opened when people were willing to take risks. James listened to his parents' perspectives with deep respect, but his mind was already made up. He had spent his entire life preparing for something he had no rational reason to believe would ever be possible, and now that the possibility existed, he could not imagine choosing any other path. The following morning, he wrote to the War Department requesting application materials for the Tuskegee program. The formation of the Tuskegee training program in 1942 opened a door that James had believed permanently closed. He arrived at the Alabama facility in June of that year, one of 300 applicants competing for 50 training positions. The selection process was deliberately rigorous, designed partly to prove that black aviators could meet the same standards as their white counterparts, and partly because the military establishment secretly hoped that high washout rates would validate their prejudices. The facility itself was a stark collection of wooden buildings and crude runways carved out of Alabama farmland, lacking many of the amenities that white training facilities took for granted. The barracks were cramped and poorly ventilated, becoming almost unbearable during the intense heat of Alabama summers. The runways were rough and required constant maintenance, and the training aircraft, mostly older models that had already seen extensive service, demanded careful handling to keep them operational. James arrived carrying a single duffel bag containing everything he owned: 2 changes of clothes, his notebooks filled with years of observations and calculations, the engineering textbooks Marcus Webb had given him as a parting gift, and a photograph of his parents standing in front of their home. He had traveled from North Carolina by bus, a 30-hour journey that required him to sit in the rear section designated for black passengers, changing buses 3 times, and sleeping upright in his seat because hotels would not accommodate him. The first week consisted entirely of written examinations and physical fitness testing, designed to eliminate candidates who lacked either the intellectual capacity or the physical conditioning required for pilot training. James found the written tests straightforward. his years of self-directed study having covered most of the material in far greater depth than the examinations required. The physical testing was more challenging. He was lean and strong from years of farm work, but the structured calisthenics and endurance runs pushed him in ways that agricultural labor had not. Of the 300 initial candidates, 215 remained after the first week. The attrition continued through every phase of training, as the program systematically identified weaknesses that would make someone unsuitable for military aviation. Some candidates struggled with the academic components, unable to master the mathematics and physics necessary to understand aircraft systems and flight dynamics. Others could not adapt to the rigid discipline of military life, finding it impossible to subordinate their individuality to the demands of following orders without question. Still others simply could not overcome the fear that came with operating an aircraft, particularly during advanced maneuvers that pushed both plane and pilot close to their limits. James excelled in the classroom instruction, demonstrating a grasp of aerodynamic principles that impressed even the skeptical instructors who had been assigned to the program. When the chief flight instructor, Captain William Sherman, asked candidates to calculate the effect of altitude on engine performance, James not only provided the correct answer, but explained the underlying thermodynamic principles in detail, citing specific studies from aeronautical journals that Sherman himself had not read. Sherman, a veteran pilot who had flown mail routes in the western United States during the 1930s, initially approached his assignment at Tuskegee with resignation, viewing it as a tedious obligation he would endure until he could return to more desirable duties. His interaction with James began to shift that perspective. Sherman recognized in James the same quality he had seen in perhaps 3 or 4 other pilots during his entire career, an almost instinctive understanding of how aircraft behaved, combined with the analytical capacity to articulate why they behaved that way. The first time James took control of an aircraft during an instructional flight, Sherman noticed something remarkable. Most student pilots, even talented ones, required significant time to adapt to the sensory experience of controlling an aircraft in 3 dimensions. They would overreact to aircraft movements, making jerky control inputs that created an unstable flight path. James's inputs were smooth and measured from his very first attempt, his control movements displaying a precision that usually took students dozens of hours to develop. After that initial flight, Sherman wrote in his training evaluation that Richardson demonstrated control sensitivity equivalent to a pilot with 20 hours of experience, despite this being his first time at the controls of an actual aircraft. Sherman speculated in his notes that Richardson's years of mental rehearsal, combined with his deep understanding of flight dynamics, had created a form of preparation that transcended traditional training methods. As the training program progressed through its various phases, James continued to distinguish himself. During formation flying instruction, where students learned to maintain precise positions relative to other aircraft, James displayed an unusual ability to anticipate how his aircraft's position would change based on current airspeed, altitude, and attitude. Where other students were constantly making corrections to maintain formation, James would make subtle adjustments that prevented position deviations before they occurred. The navigation training phase revealed another dimension of James's capabilities. Students were taught to navigate using maps, compass headings, and visual landmarks, skills that required integrating information from multiple sources while managing the aircraft. James demonstrated an exceptional capacity for maintaining spatial awareness, always knowing his position relative to his starting point and destination, even when weather conditions or navigation errors might create uncertainty. During one training flight, James and 3 other student pilots were deliberately given incorrect wind speed information to test how they would adapt when their navigation calculations proved inaccurate. The other 3 students became progressively lost as they realized their planned headings were not producing the expected ground tracks. James, who had been mentally recalculating his position based on observed landmarks and estimated wind correction angles, identified the error within 15 minutes and adjusted his navigation accordingly, arriving at the target location within 1 minute of his planned arrival time. The gunnery training phase, which taught students how to actually engage enemy aircraft, required yet another set of skills. Students had to learn how to aim at a moving target, while themselves moving in 3 dimensions, accounting for the different velocities and trajectories of their own aircraft and the target. This required solving complex geometric problems almost instantaneously, translating the visual perception of relative motion into the precise control inputs necessary to place bullets where the target would be, rather than where it currently appeared. James approached gunnery training with the same analytical mindset he applied to every other aspect of aviation. He studied the ballistics of aircraft weapons, calculated the trajectory curves for different ammunition types, and developed mental models for estimating the lead angle required for hits at various ranges and deflection angles. While other students relied primarily on instinct and repeated practice to develop gunnery skills, James supplemented his practical training with theoretical analysis that allowed him to consciously understand what his instincts were learning. The result was gunnery performance that exceeded his instructor's expectations. During qualification testing, where students fired at towed targets to demonstrate their marksmanship, James achieved hit rates that placed him in the top 5% of all students who had passed through the program. More impressively, his hit rates improved consistently with each practice session, suggesting that he was still refining his technique and had not yet reached his performance ceiling. James completed the program 4th in his class of the 51 students who finished the course, demonstrating not just technical proficiency, but an intuitive understanding of aircraft behavior that his instructors found remarkable. Captain Donald Mitchell, a white officer assigned to evaluate the program's effectiveness, wrote in his confidential report that Richardson possessed a natural gift for 3-dimensional thinking that reminded him of the most talented pilots he had encountered in 20 years of aviation. Mitchell noted specifically that Richardson seemed to process spatial relationships differently than other trainees, calculating angles and distances with uncanny accuracy without the need for instruments. Mitchell's report, which was submitted to senior Air Force leadership as part of an assessment of whether the Tuskegee experiment should be expanded, included a paragraph that would prove prescient. Mitchell wrote that Richardson displayed not just flying skill, but what might be termed tactical innovation, a tendency to question established methods and consider alternative approaches that might prove more effective. Mitchell observed that Richardson frequently asked questions about why specific tactics were taught, and would sometimes propose modifications that showed sophisticated understanding of the underlying principles. The graduation ceremony in November 1942 was a moment of profound emotion for James. He stood in formation wearing the uniform of an Army Air Force officer, pilot's wings pinned to his chest, having achieved something that would have seemed impossible just 2 years earlier. His parents had traveled from North Carolina to attend, and seeing the pride in their eyes as he received his commission, made the years of preparation and the months of grueling training feel worthwhile. The 332nd Fighter Group deployed to Italy in January 1944, tasked with providing escort protection for bomber formations, striking industrial and logistical centers across southern Europe. The journey from the United States to the Mediterranean theater was itself a revealing experience that exposed the contradictions of fighting for a nation that maintained racial segregation even in military service. The group traveled by transport ship from Norfolk, Virginia, a voyage that took 17 days through winter Atlantic waters that were still contested by enemy submarines. The black pilots and ground crew were assigned to separate quarters from white personnel, eating at different times in the ship's mess, and even conducting their daily physical training exercises in separate areas of the deck. James found this segregation grimly amusing. They were sailing toward a combat zone where they would risk their lives for their country. Yet that same country insisted on maintaining artificial barriers based on skin color, even aboard a military vessel. The ship docked at Naples in late January, and the group moved north to an airfield near Foggia that would serve as their base of operations. The field was a former agricultural area that engineers had converted into an operational airfield, with a single runway constructed of pierced steel planking laid across compacted earth. The facilities were primitive: tents for housing, open-air maintenance areas for aircraft servicing, and supply systems that were constantly challenged by the demands of supporting combat operations hundreds of miles from major logistical centers. The operational doctrine was straightforward. Maintain tight formation around the bombers, engage only when the protected aircraft were directly threatened, and never pursue enemy fighters away from the primary mission objective. This defensive posture, while necessary for bomber protection, meant that fighter pilots had limited opportunities to develop offensive tactics or accumulate significant engagement experience. The role was often described by pilots as flying alongside the bombers for hours, watching for threats that might or might not appear, and then perhaps experiencing a few minutes of intense combat before the enemy fighters withdrew or were driven off. James found this defensive doctrine frustrating on multiple levels. From a tactical perspective, it seemed inefficient. By remaining tied to the bomber formations, the escorting fighters surrendered the initiative to the enemy, allowing German pilots to choose when and where to engage. From a strategic perspective, the doctrine meant that fighter pilots were deployed primarily as defensive weapons, protecting bombers rather than actively seeking to eliminate enemy air power. James believed, though he kept these thoughts mostly to himself during the early months, that there had to be more effective approaches to employing fighter aircraft. Richardson flew his first 12 missions exactly according to doctrine, staying within visual range of his assigned bomber formation and only firing his weapons twice, both times in brief exchanges that resulted in no confirmed outcomes. His squadron commander, Major Thomas Blackwood, noted in mission reports that Richardson demonstrated excellent formation discipline and situational awareness, but Blackwood also sensed that his young pilot was frustrated by the constraints of the escort role. Blackwood was a veteran of the North African campaign who had flown 70 missions and claimed 4 confirmed victories. He had initially been skeptical about commanding black pilots, his opinions shaped by the casual prejudices that were common among white officers of that era. But exposure to the professionalism and competence of the 332nd's pilots had begun to shift his perspective. He recognized that Richardson, in particular, possessed qualities that marked him as exceptional even among a group of generally capable aviators. The first 11 missions passed without significant incident. James would take off in formation, climb to altitude, rendezvous with the bombers at predetermined locations, and then spend 3 to 5 hours flying escort while the bombers executed their missions. The routine was simultaneously boring and terrifying, long stretches of tedium punctuated by moments of extreme danger when enemy fighters appeared. During those moments, James's role was simply to position his aircraft between the attackers and the bombers, relying on his presence and the threat of his weapons to discourage enemy pilots from pressing their attacks. On his 12th mission, James experienced his first intense aerial engagement. The bomber formation he was escorting came under attack by a group of enemy fighters, and in the confused combat that followed, James found himself separated from his flight, alone and engaged with 2 German aircraft that were attempting to maneuver onto his tail. The engagement lasted perhaps 90 seconds, a frantic period, during which James executed a series of turns and reversals that prevented the German pilots from achieving a firing position. He managed to escape by diving away and using his aircraft's superior speed in a descent to open distance, then using that speed to climb back to altitude where he could rejoin his formation. The engagement was inconclusive. James had neither achieved a victory nor suffered damage to his aircraft, but the experience taught him something important about the limitations of conventional tactics. The textbook maneuvers he had been taught, the standard responses to various tactical situations, had allowed him to survive, but had not given him any opportunity to effectively engage his opponents. He had been reactive rather than proactive, responding to threats rather than creating them. This reactive posture felt fundamentally wrong to James, who believed that success in any competitive endeavor required seizing and maintaining initiative. In the days following that mission, James spent hours mentally replaying the engagement, analyzing his decisions, and considering what alternative approaches might have proven more effective. He consulted his training manuals and the tactical doctrine publications that were available in the squadron's small library, looking for concepts that might apply to the problem of aerial combat against skilled opponents. What he found was doctrine that emphasized formation fighting and mutual support, tactics designed primarily for the defensive mission of bomber escort. The breakthrough came during a mission on February 23rd, when Richardson's flight of 4 Thunderbolts encountered a formation of 12 German fighters attempting to attack a group of B-17 bombers returning from a strike near Vienna. Standard doctrine called for the Thunderbolts to position themselves between the attackers and the bombers, using their presence to deter the assault while maintaining formation integrity. The German pilots, experienced aviators who had been flying combat missions for months or years, expected this standard response and had developed tactics specifically designed to counter it. James watched the situation develop with unusual clarity, his mind processing the geometry of the engagement with the same analytical precision he had applied to his glider experiments years earlier. He saw that the German formation was approaching from slightly below and to the left of the bomber stream, positioning themselves to attack the bomber formation's vulnerable belly, while the escorting fighters were positioned above and to the sides. The standard response would position the Thunderbolts between the attackers and bombers, but this would give the German pilots time to adjust their approach, potentially splitting their formation to attack from multiple directions simultaneously. In the 3 seconds James had to make a decision, his mind calculated alternative approaches with remarkable speed. He recognized that the German pilots were focused on their attack run toward the bombers, their attention directed forward rather than checking their rear hemisphere. The sun was positioned approximately 30 degrees above and behind the German formation, meaning that any aircraft approaching from that direction would be extremely difficult to see against the glare. The German formation's current flight path and speed would bring them through a specific point in 3-dimensional space, approximately 45 seconds in the future, and if James could position his aircraft at that location with sufficient altitude advantage, he could attack with complete surprise. Richardson made a split-second decision that violated every principle he had been taught. Instead of moving to intercept the German formation head-on, he executed a steep climbing turn that took him above and behind the attacking aircraft, then rolled inverted and dove at an angle that brought him onto the tail of the rear element with the sun directly behind him. The maneuver required precise timing and careful energy management. Too early and the German pilots would see him coming. Too late and they would already be engaging the bombers. The dive had to be steep enough to build speed quickly, but controlled enough to allow accurate gunnery at the bottom. The German pilots, focused on their attack run toward the bombers, never saw him coming. Richardson opened fire at a range of approximately 300 yards, his bullets striking the trailing aircraft before its pilot even realized he was under attack. The second aircraft in the rear element began a defensive turn, but Richardson had anticipated this response and adjusted his aim point accordingly, his second burst catching the turning aircraft and causing visible damage to its wing and engine. Richardson disabled 2 aircraft in a single pass, each engagement lasting perhaps 2 seconds of actual firing time. The surviving German pilots, suddenly aware that they were under attack from an unexpected direction, broke off their assault on the bombers and scattered, their formation cohesion collapsing as individual pilots reacted to the threat. James used the energy from his dive, the speed he had accumulated during his attack run, to climb back into an advantageous position, above the confused German formation, ready to make another attack if the opportunity presented itself. The engagement lasted less than 3 minutes from the moment James initiated his attack until the last German aircraft disappeared from view, abandoning their mission objective. But in those 3 minutes, Richardson had demonstrated principles that would become the foundation of his tactical approach and would eventually influence fighter doctrine throughout the Air Force. By using altitude and sun position to mask his approach, by attacking from unexpected angles at moments when enemy pilots were mentally committed to other tasks, and by maintaining energy through careful management of his aircraft's momentum, Richardson had achieved results that the conventional doctrine said were impossible against superior numbers. Major Blackwood initially intended to reprimand Richardson for breaking formation, but the successful outcome and the enthusiastic testimony of the bomber crews who had witnessed the engagement made discipline problematic. Instead, Blackwood sat down with Richardson for a lengthy discussion about what had transpired and why. Richardson explained his thinking with a clarity that revealed years of theoretical preparation. Every aircraft, he told Blackwood, possessed a specific energy state at any given moment, a combination of altitude, speed, and position that could be converted into other forms through precise maneuvering. Most pilots thought of aerial combat as a series of discrete actions, but Richardson saw it as a continuous flow of energy management, where every movement either added to or subtracted from your tactical options. The key, Richardson explained, was understanding that you did not need to be faster or more maneuverable than your opponent if you could consistently position yourself in areas where their aircraft could not effectively respond. By approaching from above and behind, by using the sun to blind enemy pilots, by timing his attacks for moments when enemy aircraft were committed to other maneuvers, Richardson could engage on his terms regardless of the technical capabilities of the opposing aircraft. Blackwood listened with growing fascination as Richardson described tactics that bore little resemblance to the formation fighting doctrine that dominated American fighter training. He pulled out a map and asked Richardson to explain how these principles might apply to the specific operational environment over northern Italy. Richardson's response was so detailed and technically sophisticated that Blackwood immediately arranged a meeting with the group commander, Colonel Henry Williamson. Williamson was a veteran of the North African campaign who had flown over 100 missions and claimed 8 confirmed victories. He was also pragmatic enough to recognize genuine innovation when he encountered it. After listening to Richardson present his tactical concepts, Williamson made a decision that would prove transformative for the entire group's effectiveness. He authorized the formation of a specialized 4-aircraft element led by Richardson that would be given freedom to operate independently during bomber escort missions, engaging threats in the manner Richardson proposed, while the main escort force maintained standard defensive positions. The experiment began in early March, and the results were immediate and dramatic. On March 4th, Richardson's element engaged a mixed formation of German fighters attempting to attack a bomber stream near Udine. Using the tactics he had described, Richardson's flight disabled 7 enemy aircraft without loss, an outcome so exceptional that intelligence officers initially questioned whether the claims were accurate. Gun camera footage and testimony from bomber crews confirmed the results. What made Richardson's approach particularly effective was its unpredictability. German pilots trained in established tactical doctrines expected American fighters to behave in certain ways. When Richardson's element appeared from unexpected angles, attacked during moments when conventional tactics said engagement was impossible, and maneuvered in patterns that seemed to violate standard energy management principles, the psychological effect was profound. Lieutenant Hans Krüger, a German pilot who survived an encounter with Richardson's element on March 12th, later described the experience in his post-action report as fighting against an opponent who seemed to be playing by different rules. Krüger had been part of a 6-aircraft formation, attempting to intercept bombers when Richardson's flight appeared. Not from the expected direction ahead and level, but from high above and behind, diving at an angle that brought them onto the German formation's tail with devastating effect. Krüger's element leader was disabled before anyone in the formation realized they were under attack. The remaining aircraft scattered, abandoning their attack run, while Richardson's flight used the energy from their initial dive to climb back to an advantageous position, ready to repeat the engagement. The tactical advantages of Richardson's approach extended beyond individual engagements. By consistently attacking from positions of advantage, Richardson's element could achieve significant results while exposing themselves to minimal risk. Traditional fighter tactics often resulted in swirling dogfights where both sides suffered losses. Richardson's methods allowed his pilots to strike decisively and then disengage before enemy fighters could organize an effective response. By mid-March, Richardson had personally accounted for 17 confirmed victories, a total that exceeded the combined scores of the rest of his squadron. More significantly, his element had not suffered a single aircraft loss despite flying the most dangerous intercept missions. The success attracted attention from higher command levels, and in late March, Richardson was summoned to a meeting at the 15th Air Force headquarters in Bari. General Nathan Bedford, the deputy commander for fighter operations, wanted to understand how a pilot with less than 4 months of combat experience had achieved results that surpassed veteran aviators with 2 or 3 years in combat zones. Richardson spent 6 hours with Bedford and his staff, explaining his tactical concepts using a chalkboard, model aircraft, and detailed diagrams. The presentation revealed the depth of Richardson's analytical thinking. He had not simply developed a few clever tricks. He had created a comprehensive tactical system based on mathematical calculations of energy states, geometric analysis of attack angles, and psychological insights into how pilots responded under stress. Richardson demonstrated how every aspect of an aircraft's performance, from its rate of climb to its turning radius at different speeds, could be quantified and used to predict optimal engagement parameters. Bedford, who held an engineering degree from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, immediately recognized that Richardson's concepts represented a fundamental advance in fighter tactics. He authorized the creation of a formal training program with Richardson as the primary instructor to disseminate these methods throughout the fighter groups operating in the Mediterranean theater. The training program began in early April at a facility near Foggia. Richardson trained 60 pilots over a 3-week period, using a combination of classroom instruction and practical flying exercises. The curriculum covered energy management, positional awareness, attack geometry, and the psychological aspects of aerial combat. Richardson emphasized that successful engagement was 90% preparation and positioning, and only 10% actual shooting. Many of the pilots Richardson trained were initially skeptical. They had been flying combat missions for months or even years, and they resented being told by a relatively inexperienced pilot that they needed to fundamentally change their approach. Richardson won them over through demonstration. He would take skeptical pilots up for training flights and consistently position his aircraft in ways that left them completely vulnerable, demonstrating that conventional tactics created predictable patterns that a properly prepared opponent could exploit. Lieutenant Robert Chen, a pilot from California with 23 missions and 2 confirmed victories, later described his training session with Richardson as a humbling experience that completely transformed his understanding of aerial combat. Chen had considered himself a competent pilot, but Richardson demonstrated that Chen's conventional approach left him exposed to attack for significant portions of every engagement. By applying Richardson's principles, Chen went on to account for 11 more victories over the following 3 months without sustaining damage to his aircraft. The effectiveness of Richardson's tactics was particularly evident in engagements against experienced German pilots. The Luftwaffe units operating over Italy in the spring of 1944 included some of the most skilled aviators in the European theater, pilots with hundreds of missions and dozens of victories. These veterans relied on their experience and their mastery of established tactical doctrines. When they encountered pilots trained in Richardson's methods, their experience became a liability because they could not understand why their proven tactics were failing. Captain Gerhard Fischer, a German ace with 31 confirmed victories, encountered Richardson personally on April 18th during a large-scale engagement near Bologna. Fischer led a formation of 8 fighters that attempted to attack a formation of B-24 bombers. Richardson's element, reinforced to 6 aircraft following the success of his training program, intercepted Fischer's formation using the approach Richardson had perfected. A high-altitude attack from the sun side, timed to catch the German formation at the moment they committed to their attack run. Fischer, who survived the encounter and was taken into custody 2 months later when his aircraft experienced mechanical failure and he was forced to land behind Allied lines, described the engagement in detailed interrogation sessions. He explained that his formation never had a chance to execute their planned attack. Richardson's element appeared from a direction that Fischer had considered secure, disabled 3 aircraft in the initial pass, and then used the energy from their dive to climb back to a position where Fischer's remaining aircraft could not effectively engage them. When Fischer attempted to pursue, Richardson's element simply maintained their altitude advantage and repositioned for another attack. Fischer eventually ordered his remaining aircraft to withdraw, abandoning their mission objective to avoid further losses. The interrogation reports from German pilots captured during this period reveal a consistent pattern of confusion and frustration. These experienced aviators could not understand how American pilots were consistently achieving positional advantages that standard tactical analysis said should be impossible. Some German intelligence officers speculated that the Americans had developed a new type of fighter aircraft with superior performance characteristics. Others theorized that American pilots were using enhanced oxygen systems that allowed them to operate at higher altitudes without performance degradation. The truth, which German intelligence never fully grasped during the conflict, was simpler and more profound. Richardson had demonstrated that proper application of physics and geometry could overcome equipment advantages, that superior positioning was more valuable than superior speed, and that the psychological dimension of aerial combat was as important as the technical dimension. By May of 1944, Richardson's personal victory total had reached 32, making him one of the highest-scoring pilots in the Mediterranean theater. More importantly, pilots trained in his methods collectively accounted for over 200 confirmed victories during April and May, while suffering significantly lower loss rates than untrained units. The mathematical evidence was overwhelming. Richardson's tactical system worked. The success created an unusual problem for military leadership. Richardson's achievements and his role in training other pilots had made him well known within the Air Force, but the realities of racial segregation in the American military meant that his contributions could not be publicly acknowledged in the way that white pilots with similar records would have been celebrated. General Bedford advocated strongly for Richardson to receive the Medal of Honor, the highest military decoration, but political considerations made such recognition impossible in 1944. Richardson seemed largely indifferent to questions of recognition. In a letter to his mother written in June, he expressed satisfaction that his methods were saving the lives of fellow pilots and contributing to the mission's success. But he showed little interest in personal glory. His focus remained on refining his tactical concepts and identifying new ways to maximize the effectiveness of fighter operations. The summer of 1944 brought new challenges as German air defenses adapted to Allied tactics. The Luftwaffe introduced improved aircraft types with better high-altitude performance, reducing some of the advantages that Richardson's methods exploited. Richardson responded by developing new tactical variations that emphasized different aspects of energy management and position selection. On July 22nd, Richardson led a 6-aircraft element, escorting bombers attacking oil production facilities near Ploiesti, Romania, one of the most heavily defended target complexes in Europe. German fighters made multiple attempts to intercept the bomber formation, and Richardson's element engaged in a running battle that lasted over 40 minutes and covered nearly 100 miles. Using the principles he had developed, Richardson's flight disabled 14 enemy aircraft while successfully protecting the bombers. Richardson personally accounted for 5 victories during this engagement, bringing his total to 43. The Ploiesti mission represented the culmination of Richardson's tactical development. His aircraft had been hit multiple times during the engagement, with damage to his wing and control surfaces, but his superior positioning had ensured that he was never in a situation where enemy fire could strike critical systems. He nursed his damaged aircraft back to base, landed safely, and immediately began debriefing the mission with his element, identifying lessons that could be incorporated into the next training cycle. August brought a significant change in operational tempo as Allied forces advanced through France following the landings in Normandy. The Luftwaffe withdrew many of its experienced units from Italy to defend Germany itself, and the quality of opposition over the Mediterranean declined noticeably. Richardson's opportunities for engagement decreased, but his influence continued to expand as more fighter groups adopted his tactical system. In September, Richardson received orders transferring him to England, where he would join a team developing advanced fighter tactics for the expected final campaign over Germany. Before departing Italy, he flew his final 4 missions with the 332nd Fighter Group, adding 4 more confirmed victories to bring his final Mediterranean total to 47. The number 47 represented more than individual achievement. Each victory corresponded to a German aircraft that never reached the bombers it was tasked to intercept, which meant bombs fell more accurately on their intended targets. which meant the industrial capacity supporting enemy forces declined more rapidly, which meant the conflict ended sooner, with fewer total casualties. Richardson understood that his tactical innovations had contributed to this outcome in ways that transcended simple victory counts. The assignment in England involved working with a team of experienced pilots and aeronautical engineers to codify fighter tactics for the next generation of jet-powered aircraft that were beginning to enter service. Richardson's analytical approach and his ability to translate complex physical principles into practical tactical applications made him invaluable to this effort. He spent 6 months helping to write the doctrinal manuals that would guide American fighter operations for the next decade. During this period, Richardson finally received formal recognition for his contributions. In March 1945, he was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest military decoration, in a ceremony attended by senior Air Force leadership. General Carl Spaatz, Commanding General of United States Strategic Air Forces in Europe, presented the medal and spoke about Richardson's revolutionary impact on fighter tactics, calling him one of the most innovative military thinkers of the entire conflict. The end of the conflict in Europe in May 1945 brought complex emotions for Richardson. Relief that the fighting had ended mixed with uncertainty about what peace would mean for black veterans returning to a country that still maintained legal segregation. Richardson had proven beyond any possible dispute that talent and innovation had no relationship to race, yet he understood that many Americans would refuse to accept this evidence. After the conclusion of hostilities, Richardson remained in the Air Force, which was desperately trying to retain experienced pilots for what military planners expected to be a lengthy peacetime rebuilding period. He was promoted to major and assigned to the Air Force Tactical School, where he taught advanced fighter tactics to the next generation of military aviators. His students included pilots who would go on to become commanders and generals, spreading his influence throughout the service. The integration of the American military, ordered by President Truman in 1948, vindicated Richardson's belief that capability should be the only criterion for military service. He continued to serve until 1963, retiring as a colonel after a 21-year career that included service in the conflict over Korea, where his tactical concepts proved equally effective in the jet age. Richardson's post-military life centered on education. He earned a degree in aeronautical engineering from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, then taught mathematics and physics at a historically black university in Atlanta for 20 years. He rarely spoke publicly about his military service, preferring to focus on preparing his students for careers in aviation and engineering. Those students, who included several astronauts and senior aerospace industry executives, often had no idea that their soft-spoken professor had been one of the most effective fighter pilots of the Second World War. The full story of Richardson's achievements remained largely unknown outside military circles until historians began systematically documenting the contributions of black service members in the 1990s. Researchers discovered that Richardson's tactical innovations had influenced not just individual pilots, but the entire doctrinal framework for air superiority operations. The energy management principles he had developed were still being taught to fighter pilots in the 21st century, though few of those pilots knew the origin of the concepts they were learning. What German pilots had dismissed as impossible turned out to be merely improbable, requiring a combination of mathematical insight, spatial reasoning, physical intuition, and courage that few individuals possessed. Richardson had demonstrated that conventional wisdom about aerial combat was incomplete, that established doctrines contained unexamined assumptions, and that creative thinking could overcome numerical and technical disadvantages. The officers who had initially doubted whether black pilots could perform at the same level as their white counterparts discovered that the question was absurd. Richardson had not merely equaled the performance of other pilots, he had redefined what performance meant, operating at a level of tactical sophistication that few aviators of any background achieved. His 47 confirmed victories represented only the most visible measure of a contribution that fundamentally shaped how the United States approached air combat for generations. In his final years living quietly in Atlanta, Richardson occasionally received visits from military historians and aviation enthusiasts who wanted to learn about his experiences. He would patiently explain the tactical principles he had developed, using the same hand-drawn diagrams and careful analysis that had characterized his teaching throughout his life. He emphasized that his success had not been about individual heroism, but about systematic thinking, careful preparation, and the application of scientific principles to practical problems. James Richardson passed away in 2004 at the age of 85, surrounded by family members who included 3 children, 7 grandchildren, and 2 great-grandchildren. His funeral was attended by over 300 people, including representatives from the Air Force, former students, and a delegation of German military officers who had traveled from Europe to honor a former adversary who had taught them the meaning of tactical innovation. The cemetery where Richardson was laid to rest overlooked the same hills where, as a teenager, he had tested his hand-built gliders and dreamed of flight. The arc of his life, from those early experiments to his revolutionary impact on military aviation, embodied the power of curiosity, dedication, and analytical thinking to overcome barriers that others insisted were insurmountable. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.